My children booked dinner at a luxury restaurant. When I arrived, there was no seat for me. My daughter-in-law said, "Maybe a cheaper place is better for you, dear mother-in-law." I laughed and asked the owner for a table, because I owned the place. Margaret Hayes stood in front of her bedroom mirror, adjusting the pearl necklace that had once belonged to her mother. The soft glow of the pearls contrasted gently with her light blue blouse. She smiled at her reflection, a rare moment of quiet pride settling in. At 63 years old, life had been a long road of self-sacrifice and resilience. After her divorce nearly 3 decades ago, Margaret had raised her 2 sons, Michael and Thomas, on her own. There were years when she had taken night shifts as a bookkeeper, missing birthdays and school events just to keep the house warm and the kitchen stocked. But she never complained. Margaret had always believed that the most dignified strength is the one shown in silence. So when Michael called her early that week, his voice excited and slightly theatrical, saying he and Thomas had a special surprise dinner planned for her, she felt a wave of warmth rush over her. It was rare for the 3 of them to sit down together these days. Michael had married Vanessa, a high-powered marketing executive with expensive tastes and little patience. Thomas lived across the country in New York, and though they spoke often, visits had become scarce. Saturday came, and Margaret carefully wrapped a light shawl around her shoulders before stepping into the car Michael had sent to pick her up. The driver, polite and distant, didn't offer much conversation, but that didn't bother her. She looked out the window as the Los Angeles skyline melted into the background of orange twilight. The car eventually pulled up in front of a stunning building with minimalist architecture and a glowing gold emblem on the glass doors. The name of the restaurant sparkled subtly in serif letters. Eleonora. Margaret's eyes widened in surprise. She knew this place. It was often featured in luxury magazines and culinary shows. Getting a table here wasn't just expensive. It required connections. She stepped out of the car, touched by the thought that her sons had gone to such lengths for her. At the entrance, a valet opened the door with a courteous nod, and she walked inside to find Michael and Vanessa waiting by the hostess stand. Vanessa wore a sleek black dress and heels that clicked with sharp precision on the marble floor. Her smile was thin and clearly forced, but Margaret ignored that. Michael, always the peacemaker, embraced his mother with a warm, "You look beautiful, Mom." Margaret returned the hug, her heart full. "This is amazing," she said, glancing around the softly lit dining area with its modern chandeliers and hushed elegance. "I didn't know we had a reservation here." Michael gestured vaguely. "Well, it's a special night." Vanessa chuckled under her breath. "Very special," she said, her eyes flicking toward the table nearby. The hostess led them through the dining room, past whispering couples and waiters in press uniforms. Margaret followed closely behind, already imagining a wonderful evening. Good food, laughter, stories. But as they reached the table, she slowed. There were only 2 seats set. Michael and Vanessa sat down quickly. Margaret remained standing. "I think there's a mistake," she said softly, looking at the table. "There's no place for me." For a moment, no one said anything. The clinking of glasses and murmured conversations from other tables seemed to grow louder in contrast. Then Vanessa looked up, her expression smooth, almost amused. "Maybe somewhere simple would suit you better, dear mother-in-law," she said, her voice light, but unmistakably cutting. "This place can be intimidating." Margaret felt the words land like a slap, but she didn't flinch. She looked at Michael, waiting for him to speak, to correct his wife, to rise and offer his seat, but he only looked down, his fingers nervously playing with the edge of the menu. The silence between them thickened. For a split second, Margaret considered turning around and walking out. But then, something in her shifted. Not anger, not embarrassment, just a clarity she had learned to trust over the years. With a composed smile, she turned toward the bar and walked away. Michael called after her once, a quiet "Mom," but she didn't answer. She stopped at the bar, looked the young bartender in the eye, and said gently, "Could you please ask the manager to come out?" The bartender hesitated. She was elegantly dressed, but clearly not a regular. Yet something in her voice carried authority. He nodded and disappeared through a swinging door behind the counter. Margaret waited, standing tall despite the burning eyes of patrons who had noticed the strange interaction at the table. She didn't care about the stares. She had spent most of her life being invisible to people like this. Tonight, though, would be different, not for vengeance, but for truth. When the manager emerged, a tall man in a perfectly tailored suit, his face lit up the moment he saw her. "Mrs. Hayes," he said with an unmistakable warmth and deference. "What a pleasure. Would you like your usual table this evening?" Margaret offered a small, knowing smile. "Yes, please. The one by the window." Behind her, Michael and Vanessa had turned in their seats, stunned. The manager immediately gestured to a waiter, who rushed to clear the elegant corner table that overlooked the garden and the reflecting pool. The staff moved with quiet urgency and precision, clearly used to accommodating someone important. Margaret didn't glance back. She followed the manager with quiet grace, as if nothing unusual had happened. At her new table, the maitre d' arrived with a special menu, one not offered to regular guests, and a glass of vintage wine she hadn't ordered. It was exactly how she liked it. As she sipped it slowly, her eyes finally rested on the reflection in the glass. Her son and his wife, still seated at their small table, whispering in disbelief. And for the first time in many years, Margaret allowed herself to truly enjoy the quiet power of being underestimated. The delicate clink of silverware and soft hum of music continued in the restaurant, but at Margaret's table, silence reigned, calm, deliberate, and sovereign. The garden lights flickered outside the wide glass windows, casting gentle reflections that danced on the marble floor. Margaret sat with poise, sipping her wine as if she were alone, though her peripheral vision caught every movement at her son's table. She noticed Vanessa shifting uncomfortably in her seat, whispering furiously at Michael, who nodded absently, his eyes fixed on his mother. After several tense minutes, Michael stood and made his way over. His movements were hesitant, the kind of awkwardness that only shame could bring. Margaret didn't look up until he was standing directly across from her, hands tucked nervously into his pockets. "Mom," he said quietly, I didn't know. Why didn't you ever tell us?" Margaret rested her glass gently on the table. "Tell you what, Michael? That this place, that you..." He gestured vaguely at the restaurant. The luxurious decor, the unmistakable respect from the staff. "That you own it." Margaret's gaze held steady. "I didn't think it mattered. You never asked." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. There were so many questions behind his eyes, but none of them would come out. She didn't offer him a chair. It wasn't cruelty, it was clarity. The same clarity that carried her through decades of silent labor, through broken dreams and long nights balancing ledgers while her boys slept down the hall. From across the room, Vanessa rose from her seat and made her way over with the deliberate grace of someone who had crafted her life around performance. She was always a woman who commanded attention when she entered a room, poised, polished, and precise. But tonight, there was a falter in her step, a misstep in her composure. She stood beside Michael, glancing at Margaret with a smile that was more an attempt at recovery than anything genuine. "I have to admit, Margaret," she said, her tone too bright, "this is impressive. Quite the surprise." Margaret tilted her head slightly, measuring her words. "Is that what you think it is, Vanessa? A surprise?" Vanessa let out a quiet laugh, forced. "Well, I mean, you caught us off guard, sure. It's just, I never imagined you were involved in something so upscale. You always seemed so simple." There was no apology in her voice, only a thin veil of flattery meant to smooth over the earlier sting. But Margaret had weathered far harsher storms than this. Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes sharpened. Simplicity is often mistaken for smallness. "But they're not the same thing," she replied evenly. "You can lead a quiet life and still build something extraordinary." Vanessa's eyes flicked downward just for a moment. The moment stretched longer than she intended, and when she looked back up, Margaret continued. "Some people work hard for decades," she said. "They sacrifice without complaint. They invest in people, in dreams, in ideas. And when the fruit of that work begins to bloom, they don't need to shout it from rooftops. They just sit at their table quietly and let the roots speak for themselves." Michael cleared his throat, sensing the weight in the air. Look, Mom, about what happened earlier. Vanessa didn't mean to. She meant exactly what she said. Margaret interrupted gently. And that's all right. Words only hurt when they come from people you expect better from. Vanessa's mouth parted slightly, as if she might object, but the words didn't come. Instead, she turned toward Michael, her expression tightening. We should probably just go, she said under her breath. This dinner clearly isn't what we thought it would be. Margaret leaned back in her chair, her fingers still curled lightly around her wine glass. You're free to go if you wish. I never asked you to stay. But Michael hesitated. For the first time in a long time, he looked at his mother and saw not the woman who used to pack his lunch or help with his science projects, but someone entirely different. Someone powerful, composed, and unshaken by the kind of petty judgment that Vanessa wielded like a weapon. He wasn't sure if he was ashamed of his silence earlier or of how little he really knew about her life. I think I'd like to stay, he said quietly, pulling a chair from a nearby table. Vanessa's eyes widened in disbelief. Are you serious? Michael looked at her, and something in his expression had shifted. Yeah, I think I am. Margaret didn't smile in triumph, because this wasn't a victory. It wasn't about winning anything. It was about standing still and letting the truth be seen. Not with grandeur, but with unwavering dignity. She gestured toward the chair beside her. Sit, if you like. I was just about to order. The chef made a new halibut dish this week. You might like it. Michael nodded, lowering himself into the chair. He looked down the menu in front of him, the one with no prices listed, and for the first time, he understood what it meant. It wasn't just a menu, it was a symbol of trust, the kind of place where guests didn't need to ask the cost, because they already understood the value. Vanessa stood in awkward silence for several more seconds, then turned and walked briskly back toward the exit. Her heels echoed sharply on the tile, each step growing fainter. Margaret watched her go without comment. Then she turned to Michael, who now sat beside her, his expression more thoughtful than she had seen in years. Mom, he said, his voice low, how did I miss all this? She looked at him with a softness that hadn't dulled over the years. Because I never needed you to see it. I just needed you to respect me. And with that, the waiter approached to take their order, unaware of the quiet revolution that had just taken place at the table. Margaret folded her menu, handed it over, and leaned back with the ease of someone who no longer needed to explain her worth, least of all to those who once believed they had none to see. As the waiter stepped away, leaving Michael and Margaret with 2 glasses of water and a discreet promise that the chef would personally oversee their meal, an unusual quiet settled over the table. It wasn't the silence of discomfort, nor the kind born of resentment. Instead, it was a thick, uncertain pause between a son coming to terms with who his mother truly was and a woman who had never needed to explain herself, until now. Michael glanced out the window, the city lights reflecting off his glass. So, you're the owner of this place, he said slowly, as if the words still tasted foreign in his mouth. Margaret nodded, but didn't elaborate. And not just this one, he continued, more to himself now. I remember seeing a restaurant in San Francisco named Eleonora. Are they connected? She finally turned to him, meeting his gaze with calm certainty. There are 8. Los Angeles was the first. His eyebrows lifted, and he let out a low breath. 8. Jesus. Margaret took a small sip from her glass before setting it down gently. I started small. After I retired from accounting, I had some savings. Not a fortune, but enough to buy into a little bistro down on 7th Street. Do you remember Frank's Deli? You and Thomas used to love the turkey sandwiches there. Michael smiled faintly, nostalgia flashing briefly in his eyes. Yeah, I remember. That was my first investment, she said. I partnered with a chef, a young man who had vision but no business sense. We rebranded, changed the menu, and slowly people started noticing. Then came the second restaurant, then a third. I didn't plan on building a brand. It just happened. He leaned forward, elbows resting on the table. Why didn't you tell us? Me and Thomas. Margaret looked down at her hands, fingers gently brushing against the tablecloth. Because it wasn't for you. It wasn't about showing you that I had succeeded or proving something. For years, everything I did was for you. Every sacrifice, every night I spent at my desk instead of sleeping, that was for my sons. But this, she said, lifting her eyes again, this I did for me. There was a moment of silence. Michael didn't press her further. He nodded slowly, thoughtfully. I think I understand that now. Just then, the chef arrived at the table, a tall, middle-aged man in a crisp white coat, his demeanor respectful but warm. He greeted Margaret like an old friend, shaking her hand firmly and offering Michael a polite nod. "Mrs. Hayes," he said, "I hope tonight's menu will meet your expectations. I had the halibut brought in fresh this morning, just like you prefer. Shall I have the kitchen begin preparing your favorites, or would you like to try the new seasonal tasting?" Margaret glanced at Michael, offering him the choice. "What do you think, dear?" He looked slightly stunned but smiled. "Let's go with your usual. I trust your taste." The chef nodded with a pleased smile and returned to the kitchen. When they were alone again, Michael leaned back in his chair, watching his mother with new eyes. "Does Thomas know?" he asked. Margaret shook her head. "No, I never told him either. He's always been busy in New York. He's building his life just like you did." Michael hesitated, then said, "I think we both owe you more credit than we ever gave you." She smiled softly. "I never wanted credit, just understanding, and maybe a little kindness." He nodded, the weight of his earlier silence pressing heavier than before. "Vanessa, she—" Margaret lifted a hand, stopping him gently. "She is who she is. I don't need her approval, and I certainly don't need her apology. I've lived long enough to know that people reveal themselves when they think they're safe behind condescension. She didn't expect me to have a voice." Michael frowned, guilt creeping back into his expression. "I should have said something sooner. I should have defended you." Margaret's eyes softened, but her tone remained firm. "You didn't, but now you are. That's what matters." Their food arrived soon after, beautifully plated, carefully seasoned, each dish presented like a work of art. Michael tasted the first course and blinked in surprise. "This is incredible." Margaret allowed herself a small chuckle. "You always had a weakness for good food, even as a boy." They ate in companionable silence for a while, broken only by the occasional compliment exchanged with the waiter or a shared glance between them. Slowly, the distance that long existed between mother and son began to narrow, not because of grand gestures or revelations, but because of something far more powerful: truth shared in quiet dignity. As they finished their meal, Margaret reached into her purse and pulled out a thin, leather-bound notebook. She set it gently on the table between them. "What's that?" Michael asked. "It's the story," she said. "My story. How I started, what I risked, what I built. The parts one never told anyone. I wrote it down over the years, not because I thought anyone would read it, but because I needed to remember it myself. And maybe one day, one of you will want to understand." Michael picked it up carefully, running his fingers along the worn edges. It was heavier than it looked, filled with pages that had clearly been written with care. He looked at her again, and this time, the admiration in his eyes was unmistakable. "I do want to understand," he said. "I want to know all of it." Margaret reached for her glass, the wine now just a pale ring at the bottom. "Then read it, and maybe one day, when you're ready, you can tell Thomas too, in your own way." Michael nodded, eyes fixed on the notebook. "I will." Outside, the city had begun to quiet. The dinner crowd thinned, and the restaurant's soft lighting shifted subtly, marking the transition into evening's final hours. Margaret remained at the table a little longer, watching her son as he held the story of her silent triumph in his hands. There was no applause, no spotlight, no dramatic closure. Just the calm after a storm no one had known she was weathering. And for Margaret Hayes, that was more than enough. The notebook sat quietly on Michael's lap as they left the restaurant and stepped out into the cool Los Angeles night. The valet brought the car around, and this time, Michael opened the door for his mother, guiding her in with a silent deference that hadn't been there earlier that evening. The city around them pulsed with distant sirens and the muffled bass of a passing car, but inside the vehicle, The world had shrunk to just the two of them and the unspoken weight of everything that had come to light. Margaret didn't speak during the drive. She watched the streets through the window as they passed by familiar corners, places where she had once walked home after long shifts, arms full of groceries or paperwork, her thoughts occupied with unpaid bills and late-night lesson plans for her children. The city had changed, but the bones were the same. And now, as they drove through it in near silence, she didn't feel nostalgia or sorrow. She felt a quiet pride that grew from knowing she had not only survived but created something lasting. When they arrived at her modest home, Michael insisted on walking her to the door. The porch light buzzed slightly, casting a warm glow over the front steps. The garden was neat, just as she always kept it. Trimmed hedges, a few lavender bushes, and the old wooden bench that had sat untouched for years. "I don't know how to process all this," Michael said as she unlocked the door. Margaret stepped inside and flipped on the light. The living room, just as he remembered it, clean, organized, the same worn armchair in the corner, the same crocheted blanket folded with care. She didn't offer him coffee or tea. She didn't feel the need for formalities tonight. Instead, she gestured toward the couch. "Sit down. I'll show you something." He obeyed without question. Margaret disappeared into her bedroom and returned moments later with a small, dark blue folder. Inside were documents, photos, and business contracts neatly arranged. She handed it to him and sat across from him, hands resting in her lap. "These are the papers for the restaurants," she explained. "Financials, property deeds, branding files. Everything is in my name. I've had offers from investors, some big ones, but I've declined so far. I built it my way. I intend to keep it that way until I'm ready to let go." Michael leafed through the contents, stunned by the scale of what he saw. There were photos of her standing beside famous chefs, awards from culinary institutes, even a feature article in a high-end gastronomy magazine. Her name mentioned only in passing as a silent visionary investor, the kind of person who shunned the spotlight but steered the ship with quiet authority. "You were never just running restaurants," he said finally, voice low with awe. "You were building an empire." Margaret nodded once. "I suppose you could call it that. I just wanted to create something real, something good. I spent most of my life keeping other people's books in order. When it was my turn, I didn't want to be loud about it. I just wanted it to last." He looked up from the folder, his eyes shining now with something deeper than admiration. "I'm sorry we never asked. I should have been more curious, more present." Her expression softened, the hard edges of the evening melting into something gentler. "You were busy growing your own life, Michael. That's what I raised you for. I didn't want your attention out of obligation. But still," he said, closing the folder, "you deserve to be seen." "I've always been seen," she replied, "just not always recognized. There's a difference." A beat passed between them, a silence more intimate than any words could have offered. Then Michael leaned forward, resting his forearms on his knees. "What do you want now, Mom? I mean, where does this go from here?" She considered the question carefully before answering. "I want to mentor new chefs, the kind who come from nowhere like I did. I want to open a foundation for culinary education, especially for women who've been overlooked. I want to write a proper book, not just notes in a journal. But more than anything, I want to be free of the feeling that I need to hide who I've become, not to impress anyone, just to live truthfully." Michael nodded slowly. "Can I be part of it, if you'll let me?" She studied him for a moment, as if weighing not just his words but the sincerity behind them. Then she smiled, not with triumph, but with affection. "I'd like that," she said. Outside, a breeze picked up, rustling the lavender in the garden. Margaret stood and walked to the window, looking out across the yard. She had lived in that house for nearly 30 years, every wall painted with memories of struggle and love and quiet victories. But now, for the first time, it felt like she didn't just belong to that house. She had grown beyond it. Behind her, Michael stood as well, still holding the notebook and the folder, no longer just as a son who had come to dinner, but as someone standing at the threshold of understanding the full scope of his mother's life. He wasn't entirely sure what came next, but for the first time, he felt eager to learn. "Good night, Mom," he said as he headed for the door. I'll read everything. And tomorrow, maybe we can talk about Thomas. He needs to hear this too. Margaret nodded, her eyes still on the window. Tomorrow, she agreed. When the door closed behind him, the house fell quiet again. But it wasn't the quiet of loneliness or absence. It was a stillness filled with promise. The kind that comes only when the truth has finally stepped out of the shadows, not with fanfare, but with grace. The next morning began with light pouring gently through the windows of Margaret's kitchen, washing over familiar textures of her quiet home. The polish of the dining table, the modest vase with fresh flowers she replaced every Sunday, the hum of the refrigerator that had seen decades of family meals and silent, solitary mornings. She moved with the calm of someone who knew her rhythm well, preparing tea as she had always done, only this time with a strange stillness inside her. The night before had altered something. Not everything, not all at once, but enough that the silence no longer echoed with things unsaid. As she sipped her tea, a knock came to the door. She wasn't expecting anyone this early, but when she opened it, Michael stood there again, less formal than the night before, dressed in jeans and a plain shirt, holding a small paper bag that smelled of warm cinnamon and sugar. "I brought those pastries you used to love from Silva's," he said. "They still make them the same." Margaret stepped aside and let him in without a word, a simple nod of appreciation. He placed the bag on the table and took a seat, glancing around as if seeing the house through a new lens. "I read through everything last night," he said after a while. "The contracts, your notes, the timeline. I barely slept." Margaret poured him a cup of tea and sat across from him. "And I'm still wrapping my head around it. But one thing's clear. There's a lot we've never known about you. Not just what you built, but how you did it. The way you think. The way you move so precisely, always a few steps ahead." She gave him a quiet look of affirmation, but didn't respond immediately. There was more coming. She could see it in the tension behind his eyes. "And Vanessa?" she prompted gently. He exhaled deeply. She didn't take it well. "We argued when we got home. She kept saying you embarrassed her, made her look small." Margaret shook her head softly. "I didn't do anything to her. She did that all on her own." "I know," Michael said quickly, "and I told her that. But I also realize I've let her speak for me too many times. I've let her disrespect you, and I justified it to myself as avoiding conflict. But I see now that silence in moments like those isn't neutral. It's a choice." Margaret looked at him with a mother's patience, the kind that doesn't rush to comfort, but waits for the lesson to bloom on its own. Respect isn't something you ask for once someone's gone. It's something you live every day by how you treat people when no one's watching. He nodded slowly. "I want to make it right. Not just with you, but with Thomas too. I talked to him this morning. Told him a little about what happened." She raised an eyebrow. "Just a little? I figured some things should come from you. I asked him to come out here next weekend. He's curious now. Surprised, obviously, but not skeptical. Just curious." Margaret reached for another sip of tea. "That's a start." Michael shifted in his seat. "And I've been thinking, if you're serious about mentoring chefs, starting a foundation, maybe I could help. I've got some contacts in nonprofit management, and you're going to need someone to handle communications, grant proposals, all that logistical stuff." Margaret gave him a long, considering look. "Are you offering because you want to be part of it or because you feel guilty?" He didn't flinch. "Both, but mostly because I want to be part of it." She nodded, satisfied with his honesty. "Then we'll talk more. Not everything at once, but we'll start." They sat together, the tea cooling slowly in their cups, the weight between them shifting into something lighter. Michael looked around again, this time settling his eyes on a framed photo by the bookshelf. It was one of the few family photos still on display. Margaret with her arms around her sons, both boys young, grinning, the sun behind them casting shadows on their faces. "We were just kids," he said softly. "You still are," Margaret replied, "in all the ways that matter. But now you have the chance to grow into the man I always hoped you'd be." Later that afternoon, Margaret returned to Eleonora, not as a guest, not as a surprise, but as a woman who had always been at its center. The staff greeted her with the reverence they had always shown. But today, Margaret moved through the space differently. She checked the kitchen, spoke with the sous chef, adjusted some seating plans for an upcoming benefit dinner. She wasn't hiding anymore. Not from her family, not from the legacy she had built. Toward the end of her visit, she noticed one of the younger servers, a girl barely in her 20s, struggling to keep her balance as she carried a tray of cocktails. Margaret approached her gently, steadied the tray, and offered a quiet piece of advice about grip and weight distribution. The girl looked at her with gratitude. "Thank you, Mrs. Hayes. I didn't want to mess up." Margaret smiled, hand resting briefly on the girl's shoulder. "Everyone messes up. What matters is how you carry yourself after." And as she walked back toward her office, Margaret felt something settle in her chest. Not closure, not conclusion, but continuity. A life quietly built, now finally being lived in the open, not for applause, not for recognition, but with the dignity she had always carried, now seen by those who mattered most. And in that quiet dignity, respect had finally taken root.